In an office building still smelling faintly of weekend polish, a longtime employee named Sarah walked toward the elevator, her hands full with a coffee cup and a folder of reports. The doors slid open, and she stepped in, not noticing the man beside her was the new CEO, Adrian Cole. As the elevator jolted, her coffee cup tilted, splashing across his immaculate suit jacket. Her heart sank. "I'm so sorry," she said, quickly reaching into her bag for tissues. He didn't take them. Instead, he fixed her with a sharp look. "People like you don't belong here," he said flatly. Sarah stood frozen, the tissue in her hand. He brushed at his sleeve with disgust, and the elevator doors opened to the executive floor. He strode out without another glance. Sarah remained inside as the doors shut, her chest tight. After decades of loyalty, one spilled cup of coffee had turned her into invisible debris. By the time she reached her desk, the whispers had already begun. Assistants glanced her way, their lips twitching with questions. She sat down, her hands still trembling, telling herself it was just an unfortunate first impression. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The contempt in his voice wasn't about the coffee. It was about her. That afternoon, an email arrived. "Report to HR immediately." The sender was Adrian Cole himself. Sarah forced herself to gather her notes calmly before making the walk. Inside the HR office, Adrian sat at the head of the table. "There's no place for you here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Leave today." The words landed heavy. Sarah had given 30 years to this company. Her father had helped build its foundations. Now, over a spilled coffee, she was being erased. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "I've met every target, trained half the managers upstairs." He cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Your style doesn't align with my vision." "It's as simple as that." He raised his voice deliberately, ensuring the HR staff heard every syllable. "This isn't negotiable. Collect your things." The managers shifted uncomfortably, their silence complicit. Sarah felt their pity but refused to let him see her falter. "If that's your decision," she replied steadily. "Then fine." For a flicker of a second, he looked irritated that she hadn't begged. He wanted a scene, and she denied him that satisfaction. She rose, her motions deliberate, and walked out. By the time she reached her desk, her computer access had been cut. A cardboard box waited, her nameplate, her framed photo of her dad, the plant she watered every Monday, all reduced to objects for removal. She lifted the box slowly, holding her head high, and walked out of the halls, where she had once been greeted with respect, in the days after her dismissal. The halls she had walked for decades carried her absence like a shadow. Word filtered back through friends. Her departure had become office folklore. Whispers followed Adrian wherever he went. Assistants murmured, "Did you hear how he fired Sarah?" No warning, no reason. Managers looked over their shoulders, wondering whose name would be next. Adrian wasted no time making his presence felt. Whole departments were reshaped in a week. Seasoned employees, people Sarah had mentored for years, were escorted out with the same cold efficiency she had endured. Their replacements arrived quickly, polished RSMS and practiced smiles, each one part of Adrian's circle from previous ventures. To the outside world, though, he painted a very different picture. Financial magazines ran glossy spreads with his photograph, Adrian Cole, the fearless reformer. Headlines praised his decisive leadership and bold vision for the future. He gave interviews about trimming waste and driving innovation. Inside the company, the reality was harsher. Overtime climbed, projects stalled. The sense of loyalty that once kept people going late into the night began to fray. Employees remembered how Sarah had walked the floors, asking about their families, carrying extra sandwiches on long days, defending them when higher-ups pushed too hard. Now they worked under a man who had no interest in names, only titles, a man who believed fear was more efficient than trust. Sarah heard all this from phone calls in the evenings, quiet updates from allies who hadn't forgotten her. Their voices carried frustration, and beneath it, something sharper, resentment. They didn't know yet how much power she truly held. Neither did Adrian. At home, Sarah sat in silence. A sealed envelope from her father still rested in the drawer where she had left it years ago. Her hands lingered on it more often now, sensing the weight it carried. Soon she would open it, and everything would change. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. Sarah sat in her father's old leather chair, Its worn arms still carried the faint scent of his cologne, a mixture of cedar and tobacco that instantly pulled her back in time. She closed her eyes and saw herself as a little girl, trailing behind him through the company's corridors. Weekends were their secret adventures. Me, perched on a swivel chair in his office, crayons spread across the desk while he reviewed reports. He'd pause to ruffle her hair and say, "Sarah, remember this. A company is people, not profits. Numbers can vanish overnight, but people, they are the heartbeat. Treat them right, and the company will never die." His words had sounded simple back then, like a bedtime story. But now, after watching Adrienne dismantle everything her father built, they returned with a weight she couldn't ignore. Another memory surfaced. One late evening, the building nearly empty, her father leaning over the desk, his face serious. "One day, this place will test you. Be ready." Sarah opened her eyes, staring at the framed photograph of him on her bookshelf. His gaze seemed to pierce through her even now. She wanted to believe she had already lived up to his lessons, 3 decades of loyalty, of nurturing the people he once entrusted to her. And yet the humiliation of the elevator, the dismissal in HR, all threatened to reduce her to just another casualty. Was she meant to let go, to treat this as the end of her story? Or was there something more? Something he had prepared her for without her knowing? Her gaze shifted to the drawer beside her, where the sealed envelope still rested, untouched since the day she turned 55. Her father's handwriting on its surface was unmistakable. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, knowing the moment she broke that seal, her life and Adrienne's would never be the same. The first week after leaving the office felt like stepping into an unfamiliar country. Her mornings stretched out, empty of routine. Friends called, urging her to see it as freedom. Travel, one suggested. Start fresh, another said. She nodded, but their words slid past her. They didn't understand that her life had been woven into the company's walls. One evening, Sarah invited a close friend over. Over wine, her friend squeezed her hand. "Sarah, you're better than this place. Let it go." Sarah smiled faintly, but inside, her thoughts were elsewhere. The sealed envelope still rested in the drawer of her study, heavy with its own silence. Finally, she called the family lawyer, Mr. Everett, an old friend of her father's. They met in his quiet office. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "You know," he said gently, "your father didn't leave that envelope as a keepsake. He meant for you to open it. There are trust documents, important ones, that you haven't looked at." Her pulse quickened. She thought of her father's words, his warnings, his faith that the company would test her one day. Everett slid a hand across the desk, steady and reassuring. "Sarah," he said, "whatever's inside was meant for this moment. Don't wait any longer." That night, she sat at her desk once more, the envelope before her, the paper fragile yet unbroken. Her hands trembled as she reached for the letter opener, ready at last to uncover the truth he had left behind. The envelope tore open with a soft rip. Inside lay several folded documents, yellowed only slightly with age, her father's signature etched across each page. Her eyes scanned the words at first without comprehension, then with growing disbelief. 90. Her breath caught. The majority of the company's stock had been placed in trust for her, effective on her 55th birthday. Her hands shook as she read line after line, confirming it. Transfer of ownership, trustee responsibilities, voting rights, everything meticulously prepared, as if her father had seen Adrienne Cole's arrogance before the man had ever set foot in the building. Tears blurred the ink. All those years, she believed she was only his daughter, only a loyal employee. But he had made her something more. He had made her the guardian of his life's work. The next morning, she met Mr. Everett again. He studied the documents with a solemn nod. "This isn't just symbolic, Sarah. With these shares, you control the company. Timing will be everything." Sarah sat across from him in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to run from it, to retreat into quiet retirement. But another part, the part that still heard her father's voice, knew she couldn't walk away. Everett leaned forward, his voice steady. "Don't rush. Let him believe he's secure. When you move, make sure it's decisive." That night, Sarah placed the documents carefully back into the envelope, sealing them inside her desk. Her reflection in the darkened window looked unfamiliar, calmer, stronger, resolute. Adrienne thought he had ended her story. He didn't realize it was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, Sarah lived 2 lives. To the outside world, she was a woman adjusting to early retirement. But behind closed doors, she worked with quiet precision. She began with financial records. Public filings were easy enough to obtain, and the numbers told a troubling story. Revenue slipping, costs ballooning. Executive expenses disguised as strategic investments. She dug deeper, contacting a few trusted former colleagues. One by one, they reached out, their voices low, their loyalty still intact. "Sarah," one whispered over the phone, "he's draining resources on useless consultants, his friends, of course." Meanwhile, projects stall. Another sent her an internal memo detailing a discrimination complaint that had been buried. The complainant quietly pushed out. Each piece added weight to the growing file in her desk drawer. Reports, testimonies, copies of emails, evidence of a culture unraveling under Adrian's self-importance. She felt the sting of anger, but also a sharpened focus. Her father's words guided her, "Protect the people." One evening, after gathering another folder from a longtime ally, she sat at her desk, spreading everything out across the surface. Dozens of pages, each one proof of his arrogance. She traced a finger along the timeline of his decisions, the trail of damage clear as daylight. "Let him think he's safe," she murmured to the empty room. "The fall will be harder." It wasn't about vengeance, not entirely. It was about the company, about the people still working late nights under fear instead of pride. They deserved better than to be pawns in his vanity project. When the time came, she wouldn't just reveal her shares. She would reveal his failures, undeniable and documented. She gathered the papers into neat stacks, clipped them firmly, and slid them into a leather case. The evidence was ready. All that remained was choosing the moment to place it on the boardroom table. The boardroom smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood. Adrian stood at the head of the long table, sleeves rolled back just enough to suggest confidence. His voice carried as he spoke of strategic successes, projecting glossy graphs on the screen behind him. It was theater, and he relished every line. Directors nodded politely, though Sarah recognized the hollow look in their eyes. She waited until his voice reached its most self-satisfied pitch before pushing the doors open. The echo cut through his words like a blade. Heads turned, a ripple of unease sweeping the room. She walked in slowly, her heels tapping against the floor, the leather case in her hand. Adrian's smile stiffened. "This is for board members only," he said, disdain dripping from every syllable. Sarah placed the case on the table, opening it with deliberate care. "Exactly," she replied, her tone calm, measured. "Which is why I'm here." From inside, she drew the stack of documents, the trust papers, the share certificates, everything Mr. Everett had confirmed. She spread them across the polished surface. "I am the majority shareholder," she said evenly, letting the silence linger before finishing. 90. The room froze. Adrian's face drained of color, his practiced composure faltering for the first time. Directors leaned forward, their eyes darting from her to the signatures on the page. One cleared his throat, muttering, 90, as though saying it aloud would make it real. Adrian tried to laugh, a brittle sound that fooled no one. "This is absurd," he snapped, but even he could see the tide shifting. Sarah met his gaze directly. "These numbers," he said sharply, projecting a chart onto the screen, "prove our growth under my leadership." Sarah's accusations are baseless. The graphs glittered with upward arrows. She remained standing, silent, until the room quieted again. Then she slid another set of papers across the table. "Audited reports," she said calmly. "Independent, thorough, and untouched by your spin." The directors leaned in, scanning page after page of figures, declining revenue, expenses bloated by luxury retreats, consultant fees funneled to friends, HR complaints buried. One director looked up, his face pale. "Is this true?" Adrian's confidence cracked. "Every company has noise. This is cherry picking." "Noise doesn't drain millions in shareholder value," Sarah said. "Noise doesn't drive out talent. Noise doesn't silence people who deserve protection." The room fell into a heavy silence before the chairman finally spoke. "We've heard enough. Shall we vote?" Hands lifted, one after another. The decision was unanimous. Sarah drew in a steady breath, her father's voice echoing in her mind as she spoke the words that ended Adrian's reign. Effective immediately, Adrian Cole is removed as CEO, his face contorted, fury barely contained. He slammed his laptop shut, scattering papers as he stormed toward the door. "You regret this," he hissed, though his voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. The door closed behind him, leaving only silence and the faint rustle of documents on the table. For the first time in months, Sarah felt the company exhale, and she knew the true work restoring what her father built was about to begin. The day after Adrian's removal, Sarah stood before the employees in the atrium. She looked out at the faces, tired, wary, but hopeful. Taking a deep breath, she spoke the words she had waited years to say. "This company belongs to its people again." The silence broke into applause, not thunderous, but genuine. Relief rippled through the crowd. The days that followed were filled with work. She reinstated managers who had been unfairly dismissed, people who had kept the company afloat in its darkest times. HR was rebuilt from the ground up, its purpose no longer to silence complaints, but to protect the people who trusted them. Sarah walked the halls again, not as a ghost of the past, but as someone determined to restore dignity. News soon broke that Adrian was under investigation for financial misconduct. His once polished image now filled headlines for all the wrong reasons. Sarah did not celebrate his downfall. She simply kept moving forward. 1 year later, the numbers told a different story. Revenue climbed steadily, but more importantly, morale was higher than it had been in years. Laughter returned to the break rooms and innovation flourished. The company was no longer just surviving. It was thriving. Sarah stood in her office one evening, the sunset casting a golden glow across the portrait of her father that hung on the wall. She whispered softly, "We did it, Dad." The fight had never been about revenge. It had been about honoring his vision, proving that respect and integrity could outlast arrogance and greed. And in that moment, she knew his legacy and hers were secure.